Evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jim Byron. I'm the president and CEO of the Richard Nixon Foundation, and welcome to day 2 of the Nixon National Energy Conference. It's hard to imagine a subject or a series of issues more consequential to the lives of all Americans today than how they heat their homes, how they power their lives, not to mention the national security implications and leverage that our country can have with American energy. So yesterday marked 50 years since President Nixon outlined in a message to Congress what amounted to America's first national energy strategy. Energy was a new subject then, a new issue in the early 1970s that Americans had not had to tackle before. But a series of foreign crises and a serious trade imbalance had President Nixon warning of trouble to come and trying to get ahead of it. President Nixon submitted several energy policy proposals to the Congress that largely fell on deaf ears. These included research and development for clean energy, to make energy resources available on federal lands, to begin expanding the nuclear fuel supply, to reorganize the government, to create a single energy agency, boosting the coal industry, and ending controls on oil imports. And some of these occurred, like the Alaska pipeline and the shrewd strategic management through the oil crisis in late 1973, which we explored last night. But many of these policies were ahead of their time, and indeed are still hotly debated today. Last evening, as I mentioned, we kicked things off with understanding the importance of that history and paying tribute to the legacy of former Treasury Secretary William E. Simon, who served as the energy czar in the Nixon administration and was later founding chairman of the Nixon Library and birthplace. But today, we look to the present and to the future of American energy. So to help us do that, to begin day 2 of the Nixon National Energy Conference, I'd like to welcome Danielle Butcher-Franz, the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the American Conservation Coalition. She's earned fellowships with the Independent Women's Forum and the Foundation for Economic Education and has been recognized by some of the most prestigious organizations in the country: Forbes 30 Under 30, MAVPAC Future 40, Clean Energy News Network 40 Under 40. I'm sure she has many other accolades to her name as well. So Danielle, would you welcome to the Nixon Library.
Thank you. Adjust this, a little too short. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Nixon National Energy Conference. As he stated, my name is Danielle Butcher-Franz, and I'm the Executive Vice President of the American Conservation Coalition, the nation's largest conservative environmental nonprofit. I'm very much looking forward to today's programming, which promises to be both thought-provoking and inspiring. Now, since it's still early in the day, I'm going to give the coffee a chance to work, and I want to get some movement. Can I see a show of hands? How many of you have children or grandchildren under the age of 25? Okay, vast majority of you. Now, if you've raised your hand, I'm sure you already know this, or if you watch the news, I'm sure you already know this, but young people today are deeply concerned about the cross-section of energy and the environment, specifically as it relates to climate change. Young people feel a sense of despair and hopelessness about the impact on our planet and what that means for their futures. This has been dubbed climate anxiety, and it is at an all-time high. In fact, last year, a survey found that 45% of teens across 11 countries reported that climate anxiety was affecting their daily lives and their ability to function day to day. Now, you may be asking why I'm opening with climate change at an energy conference, and the truth is that to young people, climate change, energy, and the environment are all one issue, not 3 separate issues. The world we live in is rapidly changing, and the challenges that we face can seem very overwhelming when you view the world through this lens. Young people have been misled about the state of our environment, the nuances of where their energy comes from, and what their future looks like. Everyone in this room knows that when you flip on a switch, the lights don't just magically turn on. There is a back-end process that has a lot of work behind it. And similarly, we cannot and should not wish to flip a switch and overhaul our entire energy portfolio in this country. Now, that doesn't mean that concern about climate change isn't valid and important, but it's just more complicated than what young people today believe. So, it is up to us to communicate these things and to empower the next generation with a sense of agency and hope. It is not enough to just gather here today, have these discussions amongst ourselves, and go home continuing on with our day-to-day work. We must communicate these things to the next generation. The work that we must do requires showing young people that the United States has an environmental legacy to be proud of, thanks in many parts to President Nixon's leadership. Like Nixon, we must demonstrate that environmental and economic success can go hand in hand, and that abundant, affordable, and increasingly clean energy is essential to achieving both. My organization, the American Conservation Coalition, was founded to do this work and to tell these stories, to provide an alternative to the narrative that young Americans today are so persuaded by. But we can't do this work alone. Each of you is here today because you have something to contribute in these discussions. As we gather here today, we remember the legacy of President Nixon and his profound impact on environmental and energy policy. During his presidency, Nixon signed into law the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Endangered Species Act. He established the Environmental Protection Agency, and his leadership on energy policy was just as significant as his environmental policy. He recognized that our dependence on foreign oil was a serious threat to our economic and national security, and he took bold steps to address this. Throughout the day, we will hear from experts in the field of energy who are leading the way in developing innovative solutions to our nation's energy challenges. As we discuss, let us also take pride in the fact that the United States has a rich history of leading the way in traditional energy production. Our nation has been at the forefront of developing fossil fuel resources that have powered our country's growth and success for decades. Thanks to advancements in technology, we now have access to an abundance of clean and affordable energy sources, including natural gas, nuclear, and renewable energy that can complement our traditional sources. However, we must continue to invest in research and development to ensure that we are maximizing the potential of these energy sources and exploring new ones. By doing so, we can reduce our dependence on foreign oil, strengthen our energy security, and drive economic growth while continuing to build on our proud history of energy production. My request to each of you is that as we discuss today, you take this back home with you and talk to your children and grandchildren that we referenced earlier about it. Young people must hear from leaders like you. They must hear that addressing climate change requires a pragmatic and balanced approach that considers the needs of our environment alongside the needs of our people. While we must strive to protect our environment and address the impacts of human activity on climate, we must also ensure that our policies do not impose undue burdens on businesses or stifle economic growth. We must pursue solutions that are both environmentally sound and economically viable. Each of us has a role to play in shaping energy policy in this country. We must approach this work with both optimism and enthusiasm, recognizing that we have the power to make a positive impact. Let us remember the legacy of President Nixon, and let us honor his vision by working together to develop innovative, environmentally sound, and economically pragmatic energy solutions. And finally, let us inspire the next generation to join us in this work so that they too can be a part of a brighter, more sustainable future. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Danielle, and I think that was great. I can't think of a better setup for what we're about to dive into today, so let's get into it. And that starts with, what is America's energy policy today? To introduce our panel and to moderate our panel, please welcome James Coleman, who's an energy expert, professor at Southern Methodist University, and a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute.
Well, thank you so much. It's such a privilege to be here, and I feel like I've already learned so much from the discussion last night as well as a discussion with all of you. This is really a wonderful event. So I'm very pleased to be here with Bob Martin and Elbridge Colby, starting on the end. Bridge there it was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development, and then Bob was the Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Protection in New Jersey for 8 years under Governor Christie, as well as a partner at Accenture for 25 years, and has worked a lot with utility clients on getting the kind of both traditional and renewable energy sources built that are going to be so crucial to the topic of this panel, which is 21st century American energy policy. So I think maybe a couple important starting points, and then I will turn it over just for some initial remarks to both Bob and then to Bridge. You know, Mark Twain supposedly said that history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And so I think it's an incredibly important moment to be here at the Nixon Center just talking about energy because of some of the ways that the history of the 1970s and President Nixon's presidency rhymes with the challenges that we're facing in energy today. Last night, John said that when you think about the energy crisis in 1973, those lines at the gas station and those increases in energy prices, the only thing that you can compare to that in terms of the impact on society is what we have just experienced in COVID. And I think it's really important to put ourselves back in that perspective and realize exactly how terrifying that was at the time and why that is. Because the reality is that things had changed incredibly over the course of President Nixon's career. Remember that for generations, the United States had been the global dominant producer of oil. So as recently as 1953, it had produced more than all other countries combined. It was producing more than 50% of the world's oil. And that is what made it the preeminent global superpower. And generations had counted on that power, which was really a huge advantage for the United States, because it meant that the US effectively, for a generation, controlled global oil prices that are such a crucial input to economic growth. And so if our producers needed higher oil prices, we lowered production. And if our country needed lower energy prices, we would increase production. We had that power because we were the dominant producer in the world. Now that all changed over President Nixon's political career. So 1953, we're producing more than 50% of the world's oil. By 1973, we're producing less than a sixth of the world's oil. And the dominant producer has become OPEC. And that power that previously resided in the United States, and especially with Texas, with the Texas Railroad Commission, which regulates oil and gas production, had all of a sudden, that power center had shifted to OPEC. And so OPEC, which when it was founded, it was specifically, the goal was to create what they called an International Texas Railroad Commission, to give OPEC the kind of power that the United States had taken for granted for generations. And the OPEC had previously tried to exercise that power, but unsuccessfully. There was actually a failed embargo in 1967 with the 6 Days War, but in 1973 was the first time it succeeded, where OPEC only reduced its production about 25%, but prices spiked as much as 7 times higher. Now think about how terrifying that is for a country that has always taken for granted it was the center of industry. It was the center of oil production. It could control oil prices and smooth them out, keep them high or low as it needed. And all of a sudden that power has been transferred to now the dominant oil producer, which is OPEC, which has explicitly said it's going to use that power to fight against American geopolitical power and our foreign policy. And so it's interesting how that relates to some of the challenges that we are facing today, because we are, again, the world's #1 producer of not just oil, but natural gas. And at the same time, we are making a transition towards more reliance on energy sources where we don't have anything like the same kind of dominance, where we're making a transition toward dependence on minerals like lithium and cobalt, where we're not in the top 10 producers in the world. Now, in some ways, as I said, history doesn't repeat, it only rhymes. We have a lot more choice now about how quickly we pursue that energy transition, how much we build up our ability to produce those cleaner energy sources before we make that transition. But we are facing similar challenges where an energy transition is moving us from a period and a role of dominance in the global energy system toward one where potentially there's much more dependence on other countries. So with that, I'd like to turn it over first to Bob to talk a little bit about some of the challenges you see for 21st century American energy policy, and then I'll turn it to you, Bridge.
Great, and good morning. Very honored to be here today. You know, it's interesting, last night, and we continue this dialogue around President Nixon and his vision. And you look at his, both in 71 and 73 and his messages, it's quite clear. He's looking very clearly at the mix of energy needs for this country, which include fossil fuel, includes nuclear. It also included clean energy. Very clear statements about that at the time, and efficiency. And he also talked about a full comprehensive energy plan, which we currently don't even have here in the US today, which is interesting. 50 years ago, he had that vision that was necessary to kind of lay that out. I recently published an article around kind of protecting America's energy security in this time of transition. You know, right now, the US and the world are focused on a net zero carbon target for 2050. To do that, there is significant work that has to go into that, but you also have to look at how do we protect our energy security. Now, energy security to me is we need the abundance. That means you have to have the abundance and supply of energy in this country at an affordable price to make that work. And that's critical to have anything happen for the US. And those don't seem to be priorities right now that we're looking at in America. I mean, some of the stark realities are that today, 79% of the fuels that we have in this country that are consumed in the energy, 79% are fossil-based. So that's kind of the reality we have to face. We also have to face that only 12% are renewables fuels at this point in time. So fossil fuels, 79%, renewables, about 12%, and then you mix in about nuclear is about 9%. That's it. And so when we start looking out to 2050 and this runway of the next 27 years, we have to look at the fact that, we've got to make investments and continue those investments in renewable energies. That's critical for the long haul. We have to do that. But at the same time, we need to recommit, that reinvestment in fossil fuels in the US, especially around fuels like natural gas going forward. I think we've left a lot on the table with nuclear. Right now, with the small modular reactors, we have this opportunity in the future to bring in zero carbon fuels back into this economy, and not just here in the US, but around the globe to supply energy going forward. So I think there's an incredible opportunity ahead of us, but we have to face the stark reality of where we are today, where we're going to be in 2050, and what's going to happen going out into the future. There's a big discussion right now about how do we electrify this country, and that's great, but what's going to supply those power plants? If you just look at the very statistics that, the Energy Information Administration has laid out, their projections say that with renewable energy, we get to about 44% of the electricity generated from renewable fuels in 2050. Which means that most of the rest of that is natural gas going forward, unless we're able to fill in with nuclear or other fuels, or hydrogen or something else going forward. So there is really necessary, in technology and investments that we need to look at to make sure we're moving forward over between now and 2050, and then well into the next century. Bridge, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thanks, gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be on with you, and I'm just sorry I couldn't be there in person. I think this is a critical issue, and obviously one that's very much on front of mind in the domestic context. But the point that I would want to draw attention to, and I think is very consistent with President Nixon's thinking and the Nixon administration's, is the connection to the geopolitical reality. Of course, in the context of 1973, for instance, the oil crisis, OPEC was not, as James knows very well, not simply an economic actor, but it was connected to the Yom Kippur War, which was, of course, the Arab attack on Israel in late October 1973, and the potential Soviet involvement and the reaction by OPEC and particularly a number of the Arab states and Islamic states against the United States and its stance on the issue with respect to Israel and the Arab combatants. And this is, I think, a huge part. I wouldn't say the subtext. It's sort of the context in which a lot of this thinking about how to manage that new reality of the United States not being necessarily the dominant oil producer at the time. It was very much front of mind in the Nixon administration. I think that's very relevant for today, where fortunately the United States has resurged over the last couple of decades as an oil and natural gas producer. In my own view, not nearly enough taking advantage of that capacity as it should be. I think that's a major sort of mistake, both economically in terms of the kind of economy we have at home, but also from a geopolitical perspective, not only in terms of our own needs, but being able to supply other countries with our own natural resource production. And we've seen how relevant that is in the context of Europe in the wake of the Ukraine war, where they're decoupling from the Russian energy production. And it would be great if we could have higher production levels to help support that. But I think in the context of China, it'll also be very relevant. I mean, one of the major issues I think we have to infer, or one of the major reasons why China is increasingly expansive in its ambitions, and we can see this, is because it wants to have secure energy supplies as it goes forward. Obviously, it's trying to make the transition to, for instance, electric vehicles. It's unfortunately developed something of a lock on some kinds of rare earths. My understanding is that that's largely a matter of policy for us here at home. There are ways we could shift that if we were more willing to exploit our own natural resources. But that's the reality that can't be solved from one day to the next. But I think the energy dynamic is going to be huge. Obviously, the moves that the Chinese are making in for instance, brokering an agreement, however superficial, between Iran and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is, of course, connected to the energy element. The reason that the KSA in particular is important is basically because of energy, but it makes it very important. And the Chinese and the Saudis apparently are now at least conducting some transactions in yuan-denominated variant. So I think this is going to be a major element going forward. We're going to need to think about the geopolitical element and the energy element in an intimately connected way. And of course, that's not new. That's not a new idea in the context of the energy discussion, but I think it's going to be much more so even than was the case over the last few decades.
Okay, thank you so much. So, of course, this conference is organized around President Nixon's second address on energy policy in 1973. But in his 1974 State of the Union, President Nixon said he was looking to set the groundwork for an energy resurgence of the United States, not just for the next decade, but for the next century as well. And I think in some respects he was very successful in that. We heard last night about the steps that they took to improve the data that we collected and distributed as a country so that we would be able to better support and regulate the energy industry. And that now has resulted in really the premier energy source of data in the world, which is the U.S. Energy Information Administration. We heard about the increased use of government research, not just to support nuclear, but to support some both alternative energy technologies, but especially technologies like fracking that led to the U.S. resurgence in energy production. And we talked about the deregulation of natural gas, which again was crucial to America's resurgence as an energy producer, along with the Alaska pipeline and some of the other topics that we've discussed. So I guess what I wonder is this geopolitical challenge is so stark. We're talking about oil and gas, where we are far and away the number one producer of both oil and natural gas, and moving to dependence on commodities where we are way down the list. I already mentioned that for lithium and cobalt, we're not even in the top 10 of global producers. And some of the big producers of those are not necessarily friendly with the United States. Even worse, if you talk about processing of critical minerals, more than half of that happens in China, which we, of course, have increasing global tension with. So this is a very stark challenge. The more we move away from oil and gas, the more we're dependent on supply chains that, at least as of now, are very dependent on sometimes hostile powers, certainly not always within the United States. Now, I wonder, Bridge, if you were to put yourself in the position of somebody trying to do what President Nixon did, addressing that geopolitical and energy challenge in the early 1970s, what would be the kind of agenda that you would see moving forward for the next decade and generations of achieving American energy security?
Yeah, well, I think it's probably pretty similar to kind of the idea that President Nixon was laying out. I mean, one is I I kind of fail to see why we wouldn't exploit our own natural resources at home more actively. I mean, I take the point about climate change and so forth. It's not my area of specialty, but climate change is not immune, and dynamics around climate change are not immune from geopolitics. In fact, they're intimately correlated because it relates very intimately to future growth and differential growth. So, if we want to be free and prosperous in even a future of where we're addressing climate change more actively, we need to have the economic growth and power to have the basis to do so. And so, I mean, I think we should be drilling at home and making it easier to do so, and consistent as much as possible with environmental strictures, but making it much more permissive. I think that seems pretty. And then on the foreign policy level, to your point, James, commodities and other kinds of natural resources are not randomly distributed around the world. They're not all in Denmark. So you got to work with the people who've got them. And that's of course the Saudis, where I think we've seen really. I mean, I've said this in other fora here at the Nixon Library, but I think really disastrous. I mean, it's almost like anti-Nixon, disastrous policy with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that is still bleeding. I mean, the deal that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia did, brokered by China, and some of the moves they've been making with China, and even the Emirates as well, are really, really self-inflicted wounds. I mean, we can't control necessarily what Saudi and UAE do, but I think the situation is a lot worse than it need be. But otherwise, countries in the kind of quote unquote global South, we need to be engaging and focused on what matters, which is secure energy supplies, potentially making it more difficult for the Chinese to get their hands on secure energy supplies, especially in the context of a military conflict, which is plausible. That's sort of the way that we need to be looking at it. And I think that's pretty different than what we're doing right now. And I would say also, trying to maybe leverage vulnerabilities and diminish China's own leverage. Electric vehicles is a great example where, a lot of the leading car companies in the EV market look likely to be Chinese in the coming years. The Chinese, for reasons that I think have more to do with policy, have a lot of the processing that you talked about, James. Why are we allowing them to have a stranglehold? I mean, it's kind of a potential semiconductor level vulnerability, even worse because the Chinese themselves controlled it rather than a neighbor like Taiwan. I think that's kind of geopolitical. It's imprudent at best, and we need to be thinking about, how do we secure our own supplies? How do we make that as resilient and as cost efficient as possible? And that's, I think, the approach. My sense is the approach that President Nixon would have taken.
Thank you so much. And Bob, if you have any thoughts, and I'll say for both of you, we have reached the more casual part of the moderated discussion, so feel free to ask each other questions as well.
Let's see, I want to pick up the thread around supply chain aspect of this. I mean, what we just talked about was China and minerals, critical minerals that we need. One of the most important statistics that I think is out there right now, we talk about solar and building solar in this country. Right now, 80% of the full manufacturing process of solar panels is in China, and of the world supply. So when we start talking about we want to grow and how we're going to grow and how we're going to build that out going forward, that's absolutely a very big challenge for us and the world. And if we're going to continue to grow along that path. I've also had the opportunity to talk to and work with some of the offshore wind companies who are trying to build that supply chain here in the U.S. And when you start thinking about how do you start to build out, supply chains, besides we talk about how do we mine and produce critical minerals here, the other part to that, to me, is very, very important, is how do we build everything from wind turbines to nacelles to, all the other components that right now will have to be brought in and imported from other countries, which is probably good because we have a lot of trade partners. But what that does is drives up the cost of renewable energy. So to me, building supply chains here in America around renewables is absolutely critical if we're going to keep this pace up and we truly want to start getting to, a net zero by 2050, and also at the same time keeping, our fossil fuels and natural gas moving at the same time to electrify America.
Yeah, I think that's important to emphasize that undoubtedly we would like to have the same kind of power that we have taken for granted in oil and gas in the clean energy industry. And the question is, what is it going to take to do that, and when are we going to be in a position where we feel similarly confident in our geopolitical strength in those industries? But it is a huge challenge, and it raises a couple issues that I'd like to talk about. So one is, if you want to build those global clean energy supply chains, typically you're talking about two big things. There's two big things that have allowed China to be so dominant in those areas. One is cheap electricity, right? China has rock bottom price electricity because they basically use coal for almost all of it, right? Two is you want mining because it is so dependent on those commodities, not just some that are mostly needed for the new energy transition, like as I mentioned, graphite, lithium, cobalt, et cetera, but also ones like copper and zinc that we have mined for a long time but are going to need to ramp up a lot if we're going to achieve this energy transition. Unfortunately, mining, so one, we need to keep the electricity cheap. Two, we need to develop mines, and mines have been incredibly challenging. I mean, one very interesting thing about the new administration is they've authorized, depending on how you count it, $400 billion to $1.2 trillion in new spending on clean energy technology, right? So that's basically $3,000 to $9,000 for every American household in the United States. That's what we're going to be spending on clean energy technology. Now, what's that for? Well, we need copper mines, et cetera. When copper mines have come before this administration, are they approved? No, in fact, they have been rejected. So it's interesting that the US government finds it easier to spend maybe $1 trillion on clean energy to authorize than to permit a single copper mine in the United States. And so I think one of the huge challenges is reforming our permitting system so that we are able to develop those technologies here in the United States. And that is particularly urgent, not just for mining, but also to the extent that we want to use renewable energy to limit our carbon emissions. Because one of the central ironies of the energy system is that oil and coal, dirtier to burn, undoubtedly, but they are the reason they built the modern world is they're very easy to transport and store. If you get oil out of the ground, you can find somebody to buy it because you can send it by rail, by water, by truck, etc. If you take our cleaner energy sources, if you talk about electricity from renewables or hydrogen, carbon capture, those are all dependent on linear infrastructure, on pipelines and power lines. And if those power lines aren't built, the renewable energy won't be built. And so one of the big challenges that, Bob's from Princeton, there's a Princeton report out on the spending, this tremendous spending that we authorized in the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, and what it concluded is effectively it would have almost no benefit for that $3,000 to $9,000 that each of our American households are spending unless we quickly speed up permitting of power lines, hydrogen, and carbon dioxide pipelines around the United States. Obviously, the nightmare is that it ends up like high-speed rail where we spend billions, and as far as we can tell, we may never get anything. And so I wondered, on this challenge of permitting, which is, it's part of H.R. 1 in Congress, the Builder Act, we saw it's kind of built on what I thought was kind of somewhat ineffective proposal for reforms from Senator Manchin. But I think these new reforms that Congress is looking at are more serious. What do you think we need to do on permitting, and what are your hopes as far as what we're going to get done? And I'll start with Bob.
On the permitting front, I've had a front row seat at DEP in the state of New Jersey on offshore wind. In fact, Governor Christie signed the first offshore wind act of any of the states. But that was very tightly tied to economic growth and supply chain and all those other pieces of it. But what I've watched is, and I think this is an interesting issue right now, right? Because it's holding up, NEPA is holding up the development of everything from, as you mentioned, James, the infrastructure around electricity transmission, which is absolutely necessary, which I want to talk about later because I think that's an important aspect of it. But it's holding up pipelines, it's holding up offshore wind, it's holding up development of fossil fuels and developments there. So you
Bob,
look,
NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act, which is what the federal government uses for environmental review when it has to permit these projects. Yep.
Yes, that's the federal permitting, and that federal law, reigns over any state laws around any of it. So even under that, there's several state laws that fit underneath it, but NEPA is it at the end of the day. And you watch some of these projects which have been held up for a lot of different reasons under the guise of NEPA. Everything from pipelines to transmission lines to everything else have been held up dramatically over the years on, kind of on the fossil fuel side. It's kind of funny over here on the, if you will, at the renewable world side, they got the same issue. They're complaining that the groups there and its developers there are complaining that it takes so long. I mean, Vineyard Wind, what is it? They're in their 13th, 14th year, whatever it is. They still have not gone live with their project off of Massachusetts. So you look at what NEPA has done or how it's been used as a tool to keep projects from moving forward, whether it's over here on the fossil side, it's the transmission side, or over here on the renewable side. So across the board, we really should have some political consensus that this needs to be fixed. It doesn't mean we need to lower our standards on environmental protection. And having been a commissioner defending that in one of the most polluted states in the country that has the largest number of Superfund sites anywhere, I would never advocate for that. But I would advocate that we've got to put things on a timeline that if they meet the requirements, let's move it forward. Let's not let it hang on forever. Bridge, you want to offer some thoughts on that?
Gentlemen, this is your area of expertise, so I'll pass on this one. Thanks.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges. I mean, I would put it. There's really two big challenges when it comes to permitting new projects, and they're strongest for those linear infrastructure that has to pass through multiple jurisdictions, through multiple states. So think of natural gas pipelines, think of hydrogen or carbon dioxide pipelines, think of power lines to bring renewable energy to market. And the two sets of challenges that I would see is one is states or sometimes local governments blocking projects that need to come through their state. And then the second is the increasing length of that federal environmental review under the National Environmental Policy Act. And so when I said that I didn't think that Senator Manchin's bill did enough on this, basically what Senator Manchin's bill was proposing was to get rid of the state roadblock problem by putting more of the decisions with the federal government. Now, that would be great if the federal permitting process was a good one. But right now, that is also taking a lot of time. So, projects that traditionally receive federal review, for instance, natural gas pipelines. The problem is there are so many ways to stop those projects in court that we've seen multiple projects, the Penn East pipeline, the Atlantic Coast pipeline, that for both of those projects, they had all the federal approvals they were supposed to get. They defended those federal approvals all the way to the Supreme Court and won in the US Supreme Court. But they were held up by so many challenges that they were actually not able to go forward and eventually had to cancel those projects. So the problem, I think, with Senator Manchin's bill is because it didn't reform the federal permitting process, there's no benefit to giving everything federal reviews if the federal review process is not actually going to allow any projects to go forward. And this is such a critical issue for deployment of renewable energy. Right now, there are so many solar and wind projects that have been proposed. They even have their financing together, and they all 80% of those projects, 85% of those projects die before they're actually constructed because they're waiting for a connection to new power line that will take them to market. And those are impossible to get because we don't have enough transmission. So it's a huge challenge. I would encourage you to watch it closely because Congress is talking about it right now, how to reform permitting. It's a very important issue. Okay.
James, I'm going to jump in on the transmission piece of it because I think this is the part that seems to get forgotten quite often. In the infrastructure bill, there was at least some component, the federal infrastructure bill that was passed, there was at least some component that focused on transmission. And right now, the grid in the United States, 70% of the grid is at least 25 years old. The average age, the average age of the grid itself, which is 600,000 miles of transmission lines and substations across the country. Right now, the average age is 40 years old. So think about that. Some of this stuff has been designed, the grid's been designed going back to the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Think about the technology changes that have occurred. So we need a modernization of the grid dramatically. And the estimates around that range from, ranging up from starting around 350 billion a year to over 2 trillion a year going forward that have to be done. Well, not a year, I'm sorry, about 350 billion between now and 2030, just in this short period. And by 2050, we need to spend like $2.7 trillion on that grid upgrade. And so even if you didn't have renewables, we need to upgrade the grid in this country. And I think that's an important aspect. But now when you start talking about putting on all these renewables, you have to have a grid that's available, it's modernized, you can control it, you can manage it with all these renewables coming on board.
Yes, it's a huge challenge, and it's not just the electric grid that is aging. And unfortunately, I think one way simply you can think about it is that we're not going to be able to transition to a new energy system until you can build that new energy system. And we're not going to be able to shut down our existing energy system until we've built that new energy system. And if you look at oil pipelines, the average oil pipeline was built before 1970, which is before, under President Nixon, the National Environmental Policy Act, that environmental review statute was passed. So, there are our pipelines. We had pipelines that were built on an emergency basis during World War II, like the Big Inch and Little Inch pipelines from Texas to the East Coast, because German U-boats were sinking our ships going around Florida to the East Coast. Now, you might think, oh, those pipelines built in emergency, we probably shut them down long ago. No, those pipelines are still in service to this day because we can't build enough infrastructure to retire our old infrastructure. So it is a giant challenge. I wanted to talk about another big challenge that we're facing, which is how do we get enough investment in the energy system to ensure our geopolitical security as well as the affordability of energy? Because one other way that our current day is rhyming with the history of the 1970s is that we have these elevated prices. And one of the things that when prices were elevated in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, the way that we dealt with that, the way we finally killed inflation, Paul Volcker killed inflation, was by raising rates. And that really tanked the economy for a bit, but the economy came roaring back on the back of new cheap energy supplies that had been developed over the 1970s. That drilling in Alaska, the Alaska pipeline, lots of investments that had been made in the 1970s. So one challenge right now, we have the Federal Reserve raising rates, trying to get inflation under control. But one of the biggest concerns is as you raise rates, that makes it harder to get investment in those strategically important industries. And in fact, we're not coming off, as we did in the late 1970s because of the work of President Nixon, a boom in energy investment. We're actually coming off of very little investment since about 2014 in the energy industry. And so one of our big challenges is that even if the Fed gets inflation under control, when the economy heats up again, all of a sudden prices are going to pop back up because we don't have the energy to support it. So I wonder, what are the policies that we could be taking? Bridge, if you'd love to talk about this, what policies can we do? Can we make to ensure investment in the energy sources that we really need to secure both our geopolitics and our economy?
Well, I think the way you put it, James, is the right one, which is that we need to be conscious of not only the sort of the economic benefits of cheaper energy and more abundant energy that can be put, to economic use and personal use, et cetera. But also the real potential for geopolitical uncertainty and disruption that could, to go back to the 1973 or the late 70s example, where you could have, a sharp crisis, an interruption in the flow of oil, at least at a reasonable cost, that could put a huge damper on. That could be the result of conflict. It could be the result of a crisis. It could be the result of, obviously in the 1979 case, a change in government in Iran, which had until then been a very close American ally. Obviously, President Nixon had a close relationship with the Shah and so forth. So, those kinds of things can happen very quickly. And if it's somebody that we're heavily dependent upon, an external source, that can really put a damper not only on some kind of distant conception of foreign policy, but like immediately at home. And I think that's the 1970s, unfortunately, are like a cardinal example of where geopolitical vulnerability can lead to very, very concrete consequences at home. Obviously people waiting in line for gas for hours and hours and hours and paying through the nose for it. So I think that's one of the things that the things we should bear in mind. And I think it's akin a little bit to how, I've been thinking a lot about the defense industrial base. There's a lot more attention to the fact that, the traditional defense industry that we had during the Cold War, let alone during World War II, a huge, diversified, very resilient, robust, competitive, innovative defense industrial base. It's a shadow of what it once was. And I think we need a sense of, the term I use is national mobilization. That doesn't mean a draft so much as really at all. What it means is injecting resources, effort, regulatory relief, et cetera, possibly anti-monopolistic action, for instance, to make it both more efficient, possibly more competitive, well, actually less efficient, but maybe more competitive, but also more equitable and more politically sustainable. So similar kinds of things may make sense in the energy space, where, it may take government effort, whether that's just resources potentially, but also I think the things you're talking about with like permitting, often a lot of the problems with these things are not purely the ability to allocate money. Think about how much money we've spent in the last couple of years. An ungodly amount of money. How much has it really advanced our economy? I'm not an economist for sure, but my sense is that we've gotten less bang for the buck than people might have hoped. And so often it may be less the direct infusion of government money, people's money, obviously used by the government, but often like a different perspective towards regulation. In the case of the defense industrial base, it might be, well, we're going to waive this review process that takes a year. And we're going to say, well, we were thinking of building a new facility in one of the trust territories or one of the former trust territories in the Pacific, but there's a bird that, the environmental requirements will delay that for 2 years. Sorry. It's serious. Like, it sounds ridiculous, but I know that's been an issue, for instance, in some of our nuclear recapitalization, that there's like various kinds of animals or flora or whatever that are in the, that are inhibiting the ability to modernize our nuclear missile force, for instance. So that may be some of the thing that we need, but I think it proceeds from a national level conviction that we are not going to allow ourselves to be put in a situation where we could have a repeat of 1973 or 1979, maybe even on steroids. If we're all ending up driving electric vehicles and the Chinese basically are a central part of the supply chain for their batteries, that's not a good situation, to say the least. And I think we need to kind of approach this with that sort of context fundamentally front of mind.
One of the things I think is critical is that to me, the private sector is absolutely critical to driving down cost of energy, to build out exploration, to build new nuclear, to build renewables going forward. There's no doubt, some incentives from the federal government, state governments is good. But at the same time, we need to set the environment, I would call it the regulatory economic environment around that allows companies to make investments. If there's money out there, the private sector will go for it. They'll make the investments, whether it's fossil fuel, whether it's nuclear, whether it's renewable. There's money to be made and that will drive down costs long term. So from my point of view, we have to unleash the private sector around this. And again, having sat on the other side of the table of being the regulator, of signing off on permits and trying to figure out how you get this done, my mindset always was, okay, look, how do I get there from here to there? And if I'm not going to spend state money on this going forward, I can get someone to invest in it, invest in it. If they deserve a permit, give them the permit. Give it to them fast and give it to them right and get it done. Let them get it done. And I think we don't have that environment right now in the U.S. We have to have that environment overall. And to me, it's critical. And one of the comments that, one of the perceptions that I have right now is, coming back to the broader picture, James and Bridge, to me, one of the big things in the U.S. right now is we do not have an energy policy in the U.S. We have a climate change policy, but we don't have an energy policy. And to me, having an energy policy that includes addressing climate change, reliability, resources, permitting, all the rest of it, has to be part of that policy. And that's what Richard Nixon showed us, right? He showed us that you can put all those pieces together and it can work. And I feel like that's what we need right now is a true comprehensive energy policy around it. I think part of that, to me, has to be unleashing the private sector.
Yeah, and I think that undoubtedly, if we take these issues seriously, we can solve them. And in fact, we just need to take them seriously. So one indication you have of this is the time for a permit has kept going up and up, even though presidents said they were trying to speed it up. And so we're now at the point where for an environmental impact statement under NEPA, under the National Environmental Policy Act, on average it takes more than 5 years to get those. But if you look at what's happened with the energy crisis in Europe, Germany permitted and built a floating regasification, liquefied natural gas receiving terminal in 5 months. Right? How is that possible? Well, they desperately needed the natural gas and they took it seriously. And so I think if we take it seriously, we have that ability to move more quickly and more strategically. Now, this is another question for Bridge. How do we balance some of our commitments to different parts of the globe? So one thing that's happened as a result of the crisis in Ukraine is that U.S. liquefied natural gas, which is where you take natural gas, you cool it most of the way to absolute zero, so it becomes 400 times smaller. You can put it on a $250 million refrigerated vessel and send it overseas. And that's the only way to transport natural gas overseas. So the United States became almost overnight, in a matter of a couple years, went from zero liquefied natural gas exports to the world's largest liquefied natural gas exporter. And we're shipping that mostly to Europe to help it deal with Russia cutting it off of natural gas. At the same time, as Europe is paying these record prices for natural gas, because all the natural gas is going to Europe, there are other countries around the world that are losing out on the ability to afford or buy natural gas. And so you had catastrophic power outages in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, et cetera. And in Pakistan, they actually decided as a result, we can't depend on natural gas. And so we're going to build dozens of new coal power plants. We're going back to coal because that's the only thing we can depend on. And I think it's important for Americans to realize around the world, the biggest source of electricity is coal. So our liquefied natural gas exports are all that allows some countries to have reliable electricity and move away from those dirtier sources. But I wonder, how do we balance those commitments to supporting energy security and cleaner energy in some of our close partners around the world, not just in Europe, versus our need to support Europe through the current crisis, which in some ways they're making worse by shutting down their own nuclear power plants.
Well, I hadn't heard about this one, but it just makes me feel worse because it's a classic example of prioritizing Europe where there are consequences elsewhere. I'm not saying it's wrong to send LNG to Europe at this stage. In a lot of ways, it makes a lot of sense, but there are reverberating effects. And a couple thoughts. I mean, that's obviously partially a self-inflicted wound that Germany is retiring its nuclear power, which makes it more dependent on LNG, and they won't burn coal, I assume. But that doesn't mean and the market's fungible. I mean, that's the thing, is like there's so much discussion of sanctions and all that. And I honestly just, at some point, I just think it's kind of nuts that we're talking so much. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal today, or yesterday, I think, that it was just so telling, which is that the Saudis and the Emiratis are buying up Russian oil at a discount and reselling it. And then they're, and they're using it domestically, I guess, anyway. And then they're selling their more expensive stuff, which was like just the most perfect encapsulation of what's really going on here. And of course, people have to deal. I mean, Pakistan is, there's issues with food in places like Egypt and Brazil and so forth. And of course, India is buying up. India has 1.4 billion people. They are going to need energy. They're going to get it. And our national conversation, particularly in Washington, is telescoped in on Europe, and that most of the world doesn't live in Europe. I love Europe, great place, really important, a lot of allies, not the center of the world. Certainly not the only place in the world. And the Russians have a lot of stuff that people need. And this is not just our enemies, quote unquote, saying this. This is like our allies or partners. I mean, the foreign minister of India, Dr. Jaishankar, is very, I think he's very straightforward. I think he's very reasonable on this point. He says, look, Europe's problems Europe thinks that its problems are the world's problems, but the world's problems are not its problems. And this is a perfect example of that. And again, I think, look, if you're in this situation, the Russians have started a war, we have to react. Don't alienate Saudi Arabia and UAE. Make sure that you can work with them. Work with African countries or Latin countries that you might not like, or you might have objections to their government. But look, you're out there, you got to be practical. And I think this is, I actually think our whole approach on this it's almost like coming apart at the seams. I mean, the sanctions are basically not working even against Russia. Certainly they're not changing Russia's policy. In fact, Russia's doubling down. And I mean, the Chinese defense minister was there with specialists on defense cooperation, and they apparently signed, or at least were finalizing, a large number of agreements that Russia's becoming a sort of resource economic colony's a little strong, but junior partner to the Chinese. So the world is adapting, and we need to make sure we're on the advantaging side. There's no winning, there's no final victory in the world, but I think we're in this position where we're sort of like plaintively talking about the rules-based international order, whatever that is, instead of making moves and saying, look, we got to work with people, we got to be very realistic. And also, our rhetoric doesn't, this sort of rules-based international order rhetoric and the Ukraine and democracy versus autocracy, Pakistan's a great example. People are potentially there are brownouts. There's power. Look what happened in Sri Lanka with the government there. People have got like much more first-order problems. Those are sort of first-world problems that they I think is basically the vibe. And we're, out living in that world, the Munich Security Conference, and that's not the world that is going to matter. And I think this is something for us to really adapt to. The best thing we can do, I think, is generate as much of our own economic capacity and energy production capacity as possible, commodity exploitation, production, industrial production, but also make sure we're partners with the countries that actually win. I one small anecdote, I had the chance to speak with George Shultz a few times before he passed away. Obviously served in the Reagan administration, was Secretary of the Treasury, and I think director of the OMB in the Nixon administration, or was he Secretary of Labor? Anyway, certainly Secretary of the Treasury. But he said, I asked him one time, because I figured, this is sort of a historic thing, why did we win the Cold War? And in his view, he said, what basically happened was that we rearmed, our economy got going again, the Soviets were in trouble, and we had the world's other largest productive economies on our side, Japan and Germany, basically, and sort of ancillary parts of Europe. And that was it, And I mean, that seems like a pretty good policy for us to pursue. Not sure it's what we're pursuing right now, though.
James, question for you. Right now, policy in the U.S., given the current administration, regulatory and others, how do you think that's affecting investment in the U.S. across the board? What do you think is happening? What do you think executives are thinking and boards are thinking, for whether you're an energy producer, supplier, oil company, whatever? How do you think they're thinking about the regulatory environment and political environment that you try to go into?
Well, unfortunately, I think many of them are watching it from the outside, as all of us are. And from the outside, it looks pretty incoherent. And so it's often very difficult to tell even what the administration wants to do. So if you look earlier last year, you had President Biden saying he was concerned about high fuel prices and he wanted more refining capacity in the United States, and he wanted companies to invest in providing that refining capacity, more refineries to lower fuel prices. I know probably an issue important to anybody who drove past the gasoline signs here in California. And unfortunately, Secretary of Energy, Secretary Granholm, the same day went on CNN, and when she was asked, do you want these refineries to still be open in 5 or 10 years? She said, oh, well, no, we have to make a transition. Well, that unfortunately reveals either you don't know what you want or a complete lack of understanding of how any industrial process works, where you have to make an investment that's going to pay off in a facility, 5 or 10 years down the road, that's going to have to operate for 10 or 20 years at least to have any kind of return. So unfortunately, it often seems incoherent. And I think that is, when the president is often saying, oh, I want more oil and gas drilling, but resisting actually what's in his power, which is leasing more oil and gas on federal land. And so I think that kind of incoherence, I think people underrate how much of a problem it is for investors that are trying to decide whether to put millions and often billions of dollars on the line investing in American energy over the long term. And so I think it is crucial. You saw how President Nixon saw how energy was changing over his political career, and he started asking and developing that long-term plan for energy, and I think that is the main thing that we are missing right now. So with that, we have about a minute. If either of you have some last comments that you'd like to give.
I'll just say that, first off, honored to be here. Thank you very much. But, looking back at what President Nixon offered to the country back in 71, 73, 74 around energy, a comprehensive, plan of energy for this country still lives today. I mean, what he laid out is still, you could pick it up and you could almost take major components of it and push it forward. So I think that's important. His legacy will be continued to move forward because of that and remembered because of that. To me, that's probably the biggest thing I'm taking away from this, is that we still need an energy plan for this country. We need to stay on a plan, and we need to keep moving it forward.
Well, thank you so much to both of you. Thank you so much to all of you and to the library.
Thank you.